The wind of 1882 had a name and a color in Sagebrush Crossing. It was called the Devil's Breath, and its color was the deep, angry red of rust and blood, scraped from the distant mesas and hurled across the plains. It was a wind that didn't just blow, it scoured. It worked its way under door frames, through the cracks in window panes, and into the lungs of every soul tough enough or foolish enough to call this patch of unforgiving dirt home. On this particular afternoon, it was in a foul mood, slamming shutters against sun-bleached clapboard with the rhythmic crack of a mule skinner's whip. The sound was the town's heartbeat, a frantic, unsteady rhythm against the vast, oppressive silence of the land. Into this silence rode Coulter Hale. He was a man made of the same elements as the landscape sun, dust, and a quiet, hard-won endurance. He sat his buckskin mare not with the lazy slump of a drifter, but with the straight-backed weariness of a man who had pushed a herd of longhorns 200 miles and had 200 more to go. The cattle were bedded down for the day in the sparse grass by the creek, watched over by his two young hands. Coulter himself had ridden into town for salt, coffee, and a moment's respite from the constant, bellowing complaint of the herd. He drew rein before the town's stone well, a squat, solid structure that seemed the only permanent thing in a town that felt perpetually on the verge of blowing away. He swung a leg over the saddle, his boots landing in the thick dust with a soft thud. Every movement was economical, pared down by years of life in the open. He stripped off his leather gloves, tucking them into his belt, and flexed fingers that were stiff and calloused. A line of sweat trickled from his temple, carving a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He licked his lips and tasted the salt of his own labor, a flavor as familiar to him as water. His eyes, the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky, scanned the town's single dusty street. It wasn't much. A general store, a saloon with a boastful but peeling sign, a blacksmith's forge that was currently silent, and a small, steeple-topped church that seemed to be leaning into the wind for support. Everything looked thirsty. As he worked the pump handle, the squeal of the mechanism was a cry of protest. Water, when it finally gushed forth, was cool and sweet. He drank deeply from the bucket, letting the water spill down his chin and onto the dark fabric of his shirt, the coolness a fleeting shock against his heated skin. His horse drank next, its soft muzzle blowing ripples across the surface. As he waited, his gaze fell on a notice tacked to the public board next to the well. It was newer than the others, the paper a stark white against the yellowed, curling posters for lost livestock and wanted men. The black ink of the Sagebrush Bank Trust was severe, official, public auction, the headline declared. Below it, a list of properties, their owners' names, and the reason, delinquency of loan repayment. His eyes traced the lines of text, his expression unreadable. These were not just names, they were families, people who had poured their lives into the cracked soil. Then, one name snagged his attention, Coyote Bend Parcel, proprietor E. March. He didn't know the name, but he knew the land. Coyote Bend had good water, a rare and precious thing in this territory. To lose that, it was like losing a lung. The poster was a quiet declaration of war, a sign that the impersonal forces of money and law were reaching even this far-flung outpost. It left a bitter taste in his mouth that even the sweet well water couldn't wash away. From the doorway of March's Seamstress Dry Goods, Eliza March watched the stranger at the well. She had been in the back, wrestling with a heavy crate of denim fabric that had finally arrived on the morning stagecoach. Her arms ached, and the small of her back was a knot of fire. She hadn't slept more than a few hours, pushing to finish a set of curtains for the mayor's wife, the lamplight throwing her shadow, large and lonely, against the wall long after the rest of the town was dark. The evidence of her sleepless night was there in the faint, bruised smudges beneath her eyes, a stark contrast to the determined set of her jaw. She was a widow, a fact the town treated with a mixture of pity and suspicion, and she had learned that survival depended on a spine of steel and hands that were never idle. Now, pushing a stray strand of brown hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, she paused, her hand on the doorframe. The stranger was tall, lean-hipped and broad-shouldered in the way of men who spent their lives on horseback. there was a stillness about him, a self-contained quiet that was different from the boisterous energy of the local ranch hands. He wasn't a man who wasted motion or words. She saw him read the bank notice, saw the slight tightening of his shoulders, the way his gaze lingered on the paper. For a moment, she felt a strange kinship with this man she had never met, another soul staring at the abyss that threatened to swallow so many of them. Then the whispers started, insidious as the dust. They came from the covered porch of the saloon, where a few men were killing the afternoon with cheap whiskey. They came from Mrs. Gable, the town's foremost gossip, who was pretending to sweep her porch across the street. The words drifted on the wind, frayed and indistinct, but the name was clear. Hale, that's Coulter Hale. And with the name came the reputation, a dark cloud that followed him like a shadow. Brings trouble, one man muttered into his glass. Heard he was run out of the Cimarron Valley. Fire, another one said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Follows him like a stray dog. Ranch that hired him last year burned to the ground, lost everything. The whispers were like flies buzzing around something dead, and Eliza felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. She, better than anyone, knew how a reputation, true or not, could stick to a person in a town this small, smothering them slowly. She turned away from the door, forcing her attention back to the task at hand. She had her own troubles. She couldn't afford to borrow more. Her late husband, Daniel, had left her the shop and the small parcel of land at Coyote Bend, but he'd also left behind a sizable loan taken out to purchase it. The drought of the past 2 years had been brutal. Without water, the land produced nothing, and the townspeople had less money for new clothes or mended seams. The debt loomed, a constant, pressing weight. The auction notice was not a surprise, but seeing it in public, for all to see, was a fresh humiliation. Determined to push the thought away, she grabbed a small wooden box from her work table. It was her mother's music box, a simple thing of polished maple with a painted bluebird on the lid. Daniel had always teased her about it, about the tinny, imperfect melody it played, but it was one of the few beautiful things she owned, a connection to a softer, kinder past. She needed to move it to a higher shelf, away from the dust and the risk of being knocked over. Her hands, clumsy with exhaustion, fumbled. The box slipped. It fell to the wooden floorboards with a terrible, hollow crack. The lid sprang open, the delicate metal comb skipping across the pins. The first few notes of Home Sweet Home chimed out, fragile and achingly clear, before the mechanism jammed with a sickening scrape of metal on metal. The music died. The silence that followed was louder than the noise of the fall. Coulter heard the crash, the brief, ghost-like tinkle of music, and then the abrupt silence. He turned from the well, his instincts honed by years of reacting to the sudden crack of a branch or the panicked cry of a calf. He saw the woman in the doorway of the seamstress shop, her back to him, her shoulders slumped. He saw the small, broken box on the floor at her feet. Without a conscious thought, he moved. He crossed the street in a dozen long, dust-eating strides, his spurs making no sound in the thick powder. He stopped just outside her door, his shadow falling across her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. Eliza flinched, startled by his closeness. She hadn't heard him approach. She turned slowly, her face a mask of weary frustration, her eyes meeting his. In that brief, unguarded moment, they saw each other. He saw not just a shopkeeper, but a woman hanging on by a thread, her pride the only thing holding her together. He saw the deep, bone-weary exhaustion in her eyes, an exhaustion he knew well. She saw not the dangerous omen of the town's gossip, but a man who looked as scoured and weathered as the landscape itself. There were lines of hardship etched around his eyes, but in their depths, she saw a profound and unsettling stillness, like a deep pool of water. Then, just as quickly as it came, the connection was broken. Her gaze dropped to the floor, to the broken box. His gaze followed. He bent down, his movements surprisingly fluid for a man his size. He picked up the music box with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his calloused hands. He ran a thumb over the splintered wood. the spring slipped. He murmured, more to himself than to her. He could hear the tiny pin caught against the comb, the source of the broken melody. He held it out to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it. A tiny spark, a brief jolt of warmth in the suffocating heat of the day. They both pulled back as if burned. She clutched the box to her chest, a protective gesture, her knuckles white. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She wouldn't look at him. From the porch of the saloon, a new figure emerged. Silas Dorn was a man who seemed immune to the dust and heat. His suit was dark and well-pressed, his boots polished to a high sheen. He was a railroad man, the advance agent for the Texas Western Line that was pushing its way west, buying up land, water rights, and politicians with equal, ruthless efficiency. He was never seen without a small, leather-bound notebook in his hand, in which he was constantly making notes, his small, sharp eyes missing nothing. He saw everything and everyone in terms of assets and liabilities. He strolled toward them now, a thin smile on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze flickered from Coulter to Eliza, then to the bank notice, a flicker of cold calculation in their depths. He was connecting the dots, assessing the situation. He stopped a few feet away, tapping a polished boot in the dust. "A minor tragedy," he said, his voice smooth and oiled, a stark contrast to Coulter's gravelly tone. He nodded at the music box in Eliza's hands, but easily replaced. Some things, however, are not. His eyes moved pointedly to the notice board. He was a predator who enjoyed watching his prey squirm. Coulter said nothing. His face was a stone mask, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. He had met men like Dorn before, men who used words like scalpels, who built their empires on the misfortunes of others. Eliza simply hugged the broken box tighter and stepped back into the shadows of her shop, letting the screen door swing shut with a soft sigh. The brief, fragile connection with the stranger was gone, replaced by the familiar, cold dread that men like Dorn inspired. Coulter turned his back on Dorn without a word and walked back to his horse. The interaction, brief as it was, had settled something heavy in the air. The animosity from Dorn was palpable, a physical presence. The silent desperation from the woman was a ghost that lingered. He mounted his mare and gathered the reins. As he did, the church bell began to toll. It wasn't the steady, hopeful ring for Sunday service. It was a slow, dry, intermittent clang, a thirsty sound, as if the bell itself was gasping for air. It was a sound that spoke of heat and dust and broken things. The hot, weary day was just beginning, but something had already cracked open. A fine, hairline fracture in the foundation of Sagebrush Crossing, and Coulter Hale, a man who only wanted to pass through, found himself standing right at its edge. The screen door sighed shut, leaving Eliza in the shadowed quiet of her shop. The air inside was thick with the scent of linen, chalk, and the faint metallic smell of her sewing machine. For a long moment, she simply stood there. The broken music box held against her stomach like a shield. The world outside, with its biting wind and calculating men, felt miles away. She ran a finger over the splintered edge of the maple lid. It was just a box, a thing of wood and wire, but the silence where music should be felt like a personal failing. It was one more thing that had broken in her hands. She heard the soft thud of boots in the dust outside, a pause, then the creak of the screen door opening again. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. Coulter Hale filled the doorway, not with sighs, but with a presence that seemed to draw all the light and air toward him. He stood there, his hat in his hands now, turning the brim in a slow, repetitive motion. He said nothing, simply waited. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, Eliza turned to face him. She held the box out on her open palms, an offering or an accusation, she wasn't sure which. Her gaze was direct. Holding his, a small, humorless smile touched her lips, a brief flash of the defiance that kept her from crumbling. "If you break me, you fix me," she said. The words were quiet, almost a whisper, yet they landed in the space between them with the weight of a thrown stone. It was meant to be a jest, a piece of dry frontier wit to deflect the pity she saw gathering in his eyes, a way to say, "I am not a charity case, I am not another one of your misfortunes." But her eyes, shadowed with sleeplessness and worry, held no humor at all. They held the hard, brittle truth of her statement. They issued a challenge she wasn't even sure he was meant to accept. In this town, a woman alone was a fragile thing, easily broken by debt, by loneliness, by the casual cruelty of men like Silas Dorn. Her words were not about the box. Not really. Coulter stopped twisting the brim of his hat. He looked from her unblinking eyes down to the box she held. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and took it from her. His hands, which she had expected to be rough and clumsy, were surprisingly steady. He turned the box over, his thumbs probing the mechanism, his head tilted as if listening for a secret. Then, with a focus that shut out everything else, the wind, the street, her own ragged breathing, he began to work. He sat on the edge of a sturdy shipping crate, the one she'd been wrestling with earlier, and pulled off his riding gloves. She saw his hands properly for the first time. They were scarred and capable, the hands of a man who knew ropes and reins and the unforgiving nature of the world. But as he probed the delicate inner workings of the music box, she saw a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the knuckles of his right hand. It wasn't a sign of nervousness, but something deeper, an old injury that had settled into the bone, a long, puckered scar, pale against his tanned skin, snaked from his wrist up his forearm, disappearing beneath the rolled-up sleeve of his shirt. It was the kind of scar that came from fire. The whispers from the saloon porch echoed in her mind. Fire follows him. He didn't seem to notice her scrutiny. His attention was a laser, focused on a tiny bent piece of metal inside the box. He was trying to nudge it back into place with the tip of his finger. The sharp, confident tap of polished boots on the boardwalk broke the spell. Silas Dorn filled the doorway, a position Coulter had just vacated. He didn't bother to knock or ask permission to enter. He simply appeared, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. He surveyed the scene with an air of amused condescension, the weary seamstress, the brooding cowboy, and the broken toy. "A cheap music box," Dorn said, his voice a silken ribbon of disdain. He tapped the toe of his boot against the doorframe for emphasis. "Hardly worth the effort. Hail. It's the land that's worth something. The land is what lasts." His eyes slid to Eliza, and they were as cold and hard as river stones. He was reminding her of what she stood to lose, turning her small, private grief into a public spectacle of her failure. He was making it clear that her sentimental attachments were worthless in the face of his ambition. Coulter's hands stilled. He slowly lifted his head, and his pale eyes met Dorn's. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence that emanated from him was more potent than any threat. It was an absolute, unnerving stillness, a promise of violence held in careful reserve. It was the quiet of a coiled rattlesnake. For a heartbeat, the air in the small shop crackled with a tension that was almost visible. Eliza couldn't bear it. She couldn't be the battlefield on which these two men waged their silent war. With a sharp, jerky movement, she reached out and took the music box back from Coulter. She tucked it into the deep pocket of her apron, the splintered wood scraping against the rough cotton. Without a word to either man, she turned and walked away, deeper into the shadows of her shop, her back a straight, rigid line of dismissal. As if on cue, the devil's breath gusted again, but this time it carried a sudden, unnatural chill. It was the kind of wind that signaled a change in the weather, a storm brewing on a distant horizon. It slipped through the open door and wrapped itself around Eliza, making her shiver violently. The thin fabric of her dress was no match for its icy fingers. It was a coldness that felt like a premonition, a taste of the long, hard winter to come. Coulter was on his feet in an instant. The tense standoff with Dorn was forgotten, his focus entirely on her. He saw the goosebumps rise on her arms, the way she wrapped them around herself as if to hold her splintered world together. In 2 strides, he was beside her. He didn't hesitate. He began to undo the buttons of his coat. It was a heavy canvas stockman's coat, lined with wool, stained with dust and smelling faintly of sagebrush, leather, and wood smoke. It was his armor against the world. He undid the top button, then the second, his scarred fingers working with a surprising deftness. He shrugged the coat from his broad shoulders and, before she could protest, he draped it over hers. The weight of it was immediate and startling, a solid, grounding presence. The warmth from his body was still trapped in the wool lining, a shield against the sudden cold. It enveloped her, smelling not of fire and ruin, as the rumors suggested, but of something solid and real and protective. It was an act of such simple, profound kindness that it stole the air from her lungs. She stood frozen, clutching the lapels of a coat that was far too large for her, feeling ridiculously small and utterly safe. "I'll fix it," he said. His voice was low, meant for her ears only. He nodded almost imperceptibly toward her apron pocket, where the corner of the music box poked out. But his eyes held hers, and in them, she saw a different promise. He wasn't just talking about the box. He was answering the challenge she had issued, the one her heart had spoken even if her mind had tried to frame it as a joke. "If you break me, you fix me." And his quiet, steady gaze was saying, "I will," from the doorway. Silas Dorn watched the entire exchange, his thin smile tightening into a bloodless line. He had tried to assert his power, to remind them both of the real currency in this town, but he had been rendered irrelevant. This quiet, rugged cowboy and this stubborn, penniless seamstress had created a world in that moment that he could not enter. He saw the coat settle on her shoulders. He saw the look that passed between them. With a flick of his wrist, he produced his small black notebook and a silver pencil. He narrowed his eyes, and the pencil scratched across the page, recording some new calculation, some new liability to be exploited. Just then, from the small church down the street, came the sound of a piano. Someone was practicing a hymn, the notes hesitant at first, then growing in confidence. The melody drifted through the open door, a thread of simple, earnest beauty weaving through the tension. It was a sound of hope in a hopeless place. The warmth of the coat on Eliza's shoulders felt like a silent apology, an apology for the rumors, for the fire, for a past he carried that she knew nothing about. It was a promise to mend more than just a broken melody. Dorn snapped his notebook shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He gave them one last, lingering look, a look that filed them both away for future reference. And then he turned and walked away, his polished boots clicking on the boardwalk, a sound of neat, orderly menace. The town seemed to exhale when he was gone. Coulter's gaze remained on Eliza. She finally looked down, her fingers tracing a seam on the rough canvas of his coat. It was an impossibly intimate gesture, performed in the open doorway of her shop for the whole, watchful town to see. Far down the dusty street, near the bend where the main irrigation ditch nourished the few struggling farms. Another shadow moved. It was a man, indistinct and wiry, keeping to the alleyways. No one paid him any mind. He was a stranger, and strangers were common enough. He carried a heavy tin can, with furtive glances left and right. He ducked behind the large grain storage shed that belonged to the Pike family, folks who were also on the bank's auction list. The setting sun glinted off the can as he pried the lid open. A dark, viscous liquid, thick as molasses, sloshed inside. He tilted the can, and the oil poured out in a silent, greedy stream, soaking into the dry, thirsty wood of the shed's foundation. He emptied the entire can, the dark stains spreading like a disease, a quiet act of malice that went completely unseen. He tossed the empty can into the weeds, wiped his hands on his trousers, and melted back into the growing twilight. His work done. The fuse had been laid. All it needed now was a spark. That night, the campfire was Coulter's only companion. Out on the prairie, with the herd settled in the vast, star-dusted sky overhead, the silence was a physical thing. It pressed in, broken only by the pop and hiss of burning mesquite and the soft sigh of the wind through the sparse grass. He sat on his bedroll, nursing a cup of coffee that was more chicory than bean, and stared into the flames. In the dancing light, the scar on his right forearm seemed to writhe, the puckered skin a pale map of an old agony. He unconsciously traced its edges with the fingers of his other hand. The tremor was there, a faint, deep vibration that never truly went away. The smell of the smoke, sharp and clean in the night air, was a key. It unlocked a door in his mind he tried to keep bolted shut. One whiff, and he was no longer in Texas, 1882. He was back in the Wyoming territory, a year ago. The air wasn't clean, it was thick and black, searing his lungs, tasting of burnt hair and panic. The barn wasn't just burning, it was an incandescent beast, roaring its fury at the night sky. The screams of the trapped cattle were a sound of pure hell. He remembered the heat, a solid wall that pushed him back, blistering his skin through his shirt. He and his friend, Jeb, had been trying to get the last of the horses out. They had all of them, they thought. But then came the shriek, thin and high-pitched, not from an animal. It was from the hayloft. The rancher's boy, barely 8 years old, had been hiding up there, playing. He and Jeb hadn't hesitated. They'd looked at each other, a single, shared glance of grim understanding, and plunged back into the inferno. He remembered the smoke, a blinding, choking fog. He remembered finding the boy, limp and coughing, and slinging him over his shoulder. The child's small body was a dead weight. Coming down the ladder, a support beam, eaten through by the fire, gave way. It crashed down, a shower of embers and flaming debris raining around them. One piece, a long, glowing brand, fell across his arm. He remembered the searing pain, the smell of his own flesh cooking. He hadn't cried out. He couldn't. All his air was gone. His focus narrowed to a single point, the square of night sky visible through the barn door. Get the boy out. He had made it, stumbling out into the cool air, collapsing to his knees, the child tumbling safely into the grass. He had saved the boy. But when he looked back, screaming his friend's name, the roof of the barn groaned, sighed, and collapsed inward in a volcanic eruption of sparks and flame. Jeb never came out. They found what was left of him the next morning. The fire had taken his friend and left Coulter with a scar, a tremor, and a reputation that clung to him like the smell of smoke. He wasn't a hero. In the whispers that followed him from town to town, he was an omen, the man who brought the fire. Miles away, in the suffocating stillness of her shop, Eliza March was also awake. Lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the dress forms look like silent, headless companions. She sat in her low rocking chair, not sewing, not working, but simply holding the heavy canvas coat Coulter Hale had left with her. She had intended to give it back immediately, to thank him and send him on his way, but he had ridden out of town to his herd without a word, and she was left with this piece of him. The coat was a tangible thing, heavy in her lap, the wool lining soft against her fingers. It carried his scent, a mix of sage, dust, horse, and that faint, ever-present trace of wood smoke. She buried her face in the collar, inhaling deeply. The scent didn't frighten her. It grounded her. It was the smell of a man who lived a hard life, who faced the elements and endured. She ran her hand down the sleeve and her fingers found the scar's mirror a small, three-cornered tear in the canvas, as if it had been snagged on a nail. And as she sat there, the weight of the coat and the scent of smoke became a key for her. 2. Unlocking her own bolted door. She wasn't in her shop. 1882. She was at the bottom of Stone Creek Canyon. 2 years ago. It wasn't fire, but its opposite that had been her undoing. Water. It had been a beautiful spring day, the first real warmth after a long winter. She and her husband, Daniel, had taken a picnic down to the creek bed. The sky was a flawless, painted blue, but high in the mountains, miles away, a sudden, violent thunderstorm had broken. They had no warning. 1 minute, the creek was a gentle, gurgling stream, whispering over smooth stones. The next, they heard a low rumble that wasn't thunder. The sound grew, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. A wall of water, brown and churning, filled with debris branches, rocks. Entire trees came around the bend in the canyon. It wasn't a flood, it was a liquid avalanche. They had scrambled for higher ground, but Daniel's foot slipped on the wet shale. He He went down. The water was on them in a second. She remembered the cold, a shocking, paralyzing force that stole her breath. It tore him from her grasp. She saw his face for a single, terrible instant, his eyes wide with surprise and terror. He shouted her name, and then the white, frothing water swallowed the sound, swallowed him. She was thrown against the canyon wall, clinging to the roots of a stubborn cedar tree as the flood raged past. Its voice the only thing left in the world. When it was over, when the water receded to a muddy, sullen torrent, he was gone. They found his body 3 days later, miles downstream. The water had taken her husband and left her with a silence, a fear of being swept away, and a deep, abiding loneliness. Fire and water. One man burned, one woman drowned. These two elemental forces had carved them, scoured them, and left them stranded on opposite shores of the same sea of grief. They had been closed up by their respective tragedies, locked into a stubborn, protective silence. It was a language they both understood without speaking. The next morning, the sunlight that streamed through Eliza's shop window seemed thin and pale. She laid Coulter's coat out on her large work table. She found the right thread, a heavy waxed linen the color of the canvas. Her needle was sharp, with small, precise stitches. She began to mend the tear. The needle moved in and out of the thick fabric, a quiet, rhythmic motion. Each stitch was a tiny act of defiance against the unraveling of the world. She was a seamstress. This is what she did. She made things whole. As she worked, the smell of smoke rose from the fabric, but today it smelled less like a disaster and more like a story she was just beginning to read. Out at his camp, Coulter worked on a project of his own. He sat on a log, the morning sun warming his back, the music box cradled in his lap. He had identified the problem a single pin on the rotating cylinder had bent, jamming the mechanism. It was too delicate to be bent back. It would just snap. It needed to be replaced. He needed a tiny piece of strong, hard steel. Rummaging through his saddlebags, he found what he was looking for: a spare horseshoe nail. It was a common, ugly thing, but it was made of good steel. With a small file he used for sharpening his knife, he began the painstaking work. He spent the better part of an hour filing the nail down, shaping it, narrowing the tip until it was no thicker than the other pins on the cylinder. His large, scarred hands worked with an almost impossible delicacy and patience. He was a man who drove cattle, who lived a life of broad, rough movements. But here, in the quiet of the morning, he was as focused and precise as a watchmaker. Finally, he carefully broke off the tiny, shaped point and, using the tip of his knife, wedged it into the empty hole on the cylinder. It was a perfect fit. He held his breath and turned the small, winding key. There was a click, a whir, and then music. The first few notes of Home Sweet Home trembled in the air. The sound was thin, a little hesitant, as if it were just waking from a long, bad dream, but it was there. The melody played through, unbroken. Later that day, he rode back into Sagebrush Crossing. He didn't go to the saloon or the general store. He went straight to Eliza's shop. He walked in without a word, his spurs jingling softly on the floorboards. He placed the maple box on her counter. She looked up from her work, her eyes wide and questioning. He simply reached out and turned the key. The tinny, hopeful melody of Home Sweet Home filled the small room. It wasn't a grand sound, but it was whole. It was mended. Eliza stared at the box, at the tiny bluebird painted on the lid, as the music played. She felt a knot in her throat tighten, a pressure build behind her eyes. It was the sound of a promise kept, the sound of a kindness she hadn't asked for and didn't think she deserved. It was too much. She turned her face away, pretending to examine a bolt of calico on the shelf, and took a slow, deep breath, fighting for composure. While this quiet moment unfolded, the town's gears continued to grind. At the bank, the head clerk, a man with a perpetually sour expression, took a ledger from his desk and walked to the notice board. He uncorked a bottle of red ink, dipped a pen, and with a series of decisive, scratchy strokes, drew a thick, ominous line through the name E. March on the auction notice. The red ink was the color of a fresh wound. and in the smoky back room of the saloon, Silas Dorn was concluding some business. Across the table from him sat Deputy Riggs, a large, slovenly man whose silver star was tarnished and whose uniform was strained at the seams. Dorn pushed a piece of paper across the table. It wasn't a legal document, just a simple contract for security and consultation services related to the railroad survey work. The payment amount was substantial. "A man of your talents should be properly compensated for ensuring the smooth progress of industry," Dorn said, his voice smooth as whiskey. Riggs grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Progress is what I'm all about," he said. He took the pen Dorn offered, but before he signed, he took a fresh chew of tobacco from his pouch. As he leaned forward to scratch his name on the line, a single, dark brown drop of tobacco juice fell from his lip and landed on the paper, just beside the signature line. Dorn's eyes narrowed in a flicker of disgust, but his smile never wavered. The deal was done. The law had been bought. Outside, the sky was changing. The brilliant, hard blue of the morning had been replaced by a bruised, purple-gray haze in the west. The wind picked up, carrying not just dust but a new, damp chill. High, anvil-shaped clouds were building on the horizon, their edges glowing with a strange, ominous light. A low, distant rumble echoed across the plains. It wasn't the sound of a train. It was the sound of thunder. A storm was coming. The silence in the days that followed was a fragile skin stretched over a wound. Coulter Hale and Eliza March moved in separate orbits, their brief connection a memory as tangible as the repaired music box that now sat on her shelf and the mended coat that hung on a peg by her door. But beneath the surface of the town's daily rhythms, a deeper wrongness was taking root. It began with the water, the main irrigation ditch, the lifeblood for the small farms that clung to the edges of Sagebrush Crossing, began to run low. At first, it was a trickle, then a muddy, listless crawl. Within 2 days, it was bone dry. Under the relentless sun, the land began to show its thirst. The soil, once dark and loamy near the ditch, turned a pale, sickly tan and began to pull apart, creating a fine, cruel mosaic of drought. The cornstalks in Farmer Pike's field, which had stood so hopefully just a week before, began to yellow and curl in on themselves, their leaves rattling in the hot wind like dry bones. It was a slow, quiet death, and it spread a pall of despair over the families who depended on that water. They checked the ditch daily, their faces growing longer, their shoulders slumping further with each fruitless visit. The water was gone, and no one knew why. No one, perhaps, except Silas Dorn. While the farmers watched their livelihoods wither, the eastern edge of town was a hive of activity. The Texas Western Line was no longer an abstract threat. It was a physical scar being carved into the landscape. Day after day, a crew of rough-looking men, hired from out of town, graded the earth, laying down wooden ties with a rhythmic, percussive clang of sledgehammers that echoed across the plains. They worked under the watchful eye of a foreman who answered only to Dorn. Then came the new horses. They weren't the steady, sensible cow ponies the locals rode. Dorn had a string of a dozen powerful draft horses brought in, massive animals with feathered hooves and muscles that bunched like knotted ropes under their hides. He began testing the graded railbed by having his men run them in teams up and down the 2-mile stretch of finished track, pulling heavy, weighted sleds. The official reason was to settle the earth. The real reason was a show of force, the thunder of their hooves, the jangle of their heavy harnesses, and the clouds of red dust they kicked up were a constant, arrogant announcement of Dorn's presence and power. The noise and dust settled over everything, a constant irritant. A few of the town's children, drawn by the novelty, would stand at a safe distance and wave, their small hands fluttering in the hazy air. But their smiles were uncertain, their eyes wide with an instinctual fear of this new, loud, and disruptive force that had invaded their world. On the 3rd day of the dry ditch, the air was particularly hot and still, the dust from the railroad work hanging in a thick, choking fog. Eliza had stepped out of her shop to take a basket of mended clothes over to the blacksmith's wife. The small music box was in her apron pocket. She had taken to carrying it with her. its light weight a secret comfort, a reminder of a kindness that had appeared so unexpectedly in her life. As she crossed the street, the familiar clang of hammers was suddenly joined by a new, terrifying sound. It was the high, piercing shriek of a steam whistle. Dorn's foreman had brought in a small, experimental steam engine on a wagon, and he was testing its boiler. The sound was utterly alien, a mechanical scream that ripped through the quiet air. It was too much for one of the horses. It was a young bay, already skittish from the noise and the unfamiliar work. The whistle struck it like a physical blow. Its eyes went wide, rolling in their sockets to show the whites. It let out a terrified whinny, reared back on its haunches with a violent, convulsive strength, and the thick leather lead rope in the handler's hand snapped with the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The horse was free. Blind with panic, it bolted, but it didn't run for the open prairie. It wheeled around and galloped straight for the heart of the town, for the market square, its heavy iron-shod hooves striking sparks on the stones, its breath coming in great, heaving snorts of terror. People scattered. A wagon driver hauled on his reins, his mules braying in protest. Chickens squawked and fluttered out of the way. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and shouting. Eliza froze for a second, her heart leaping into her throat. Right in the path of the stampeding horse was the blacksmith's daughter, Sarah, a small girl of 6 with bright red ribbons in her braids. She had been chasing a hoop and now stood paralyzed, her small face a perfect circle of terror, the hoop falling from her fingers and wobbling to a stop in the dust. There was no time to think. Eliza reacted on pure instinct. She dropped the basket of laundry and lunged forward, covering the dozen feet between them in a desperate sprint. She grabbed Sarah by the arm and shoved her, hard, toward the safety of the boardwalk. "Get back!" she screamed. The little girl stumbled, falling safely into the dust just as the horse thundered past, its hot, sweaty flank brushing against Eliza's side. The momentum of her shove, however, sent Eliza off balance. Her feet tangled, and she went down, hard. She threw out a hand to break her fall, and her wrist hit the hard-packed earth with a sickening crack of bone and cartilage. A bolt of white-hot pain shot up her arm, so intense it made her gasp. As she fell, the small, precious music box was jolted from her apron pocket. It flew through the air in a short, tragic arc and landed on the street with a metallic clatter, the polished maple case denting as it struck a loose stone. Coulter Hale saw it all. He had been on the verge of mounting his horse in front of the general store, a fresh sack of coffee and salt in his saddlebags. He saw the whistles shriek, the horse's panic, the frozen child, and Eliza's desperate, selfless act of courage. The moment she fell, he was moving. He swung into his saddle, his mare responding instantly to the urgent pressure of his knees. He didn't waste time with the reins. As the panicked bay galloped past, he was already reaching for the lariat coiled at his side. His movements were a blur of practiced efficiency. The rope sang as he built his loop, his wrist flicking with an artist's precision. He spurred his horse forward, easily closing the distance. The loop sailed through the air, a perfect, open circle, and settled cleanly over the bay's head. Coulter didn't pull back immediately. He let the rope play out, then wrapped the end around his saddle horn, using his own horse's weight and momentum as a brake. The rope went taut with a low, groaning hum. The bay was jerked sideways, fighting against the pressure, its powerful legs churning up the dirt. For a tense 30 seconds, it was a battle of wills, man and beast against pure panic. Coulter spoke to the horse in a low, steady voice, a stream of calming sounds that was more about tone than words. Slowly, expertly, he drew the terrified animal in, turning its head, forcing it into a tight circle until, trembling and lathered in sweat, it finally slowed to a stop, its sides heaving. He dismounted and, keeping the rope taut, led the horse to the thick hitching post outside the town's small post office, securing it with a series of swift, non-slip knots. The immediate danger was over. The town collectively exhaled. A small crowd had gathered, and they began to buzz with talk. But Coulter ignored them. His attention was fixed on the woman still sitting in the dust of the street. He strode over to her, his long legs eating up the ground. He knelt beside her, his face a mask of concern. "Are you hurt?" Eliza was cradling her right wrist with her left hand, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin, white line against the pain. "My wrist," she managed to say through gritted teeth. I think I sprained it." He gently took her hand, his touch surprisingly careful. The wrist was already beginning to swell, a puffy, discolored lump rising over the delicate bones. It was a bad sprain, maybe worse. She needed a cold compress and a bandage, fast. He looked around. There was nothing. Then his eyes fell on his own coat, the one she had returned to him, the one he wore despite the heat out of habit. Without a second thought, he reached inside, grabbed the soft wool lining near the hem, and with a single, powerful motion tore a long, clean strip from it. The sound of ripping fabric was loud in the sudden quiet. He took her arm again, his movements deft and sure. "This will have to do for now," he said, his voice low and steady. He carefully wrapped the strip of wool around her swelling wrist, his scarred fingers moving with a focused gentleness. He made the bandage snug but not too tight, providing support, his touch both professional and profoundly personal. For the second time, a piece of his coat, his armor, had been used to protect her. From across the square, Silas Dorn, who had come out of the saloon to watch the commotion, observed the entire scene. When it was over, he began to applaud, a slow, deliberate clap that drew everyone's attention. He strolled toward them, his polished boots immaculate in the dust. "A splendid display. Mr. Hale," Dorn announced, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "Quite the hero. Sagebrush Crossing is in your debt." He smiled, but his eyes were cold, calculating chips of stone. He wasn't looking at Coulter's work with the horse. He was looking at Coulter's hands tending to Eliza's wrist. He was measuring the depth of this unexpected alliance. Coulter didn't even look up. He was focused on tying off the makeshift bandage. He gave Dorn no reply, his silence a more potent insult than any words. His work done. His gaze swept the ground around them and found what he was looking for. He reached out and picked up the music box. The maple wood was dented on one corner, the lid slightly askew. He tried the winding key. It wouldn't turn. The mechanism was jammed again. Something inside had been knocked out of place by the fall. He held it in his palm, the twice-broken thing feeling heavy with a significance he couldn't name. He looked at Eliza, who was watching him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears of pain and gratitude. He held the box up slightly. "I'll fix it," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. It was the same promise as before, but it meant more now. It was becoming their refrain, a pledge renewed in the midst of chaos. Eliza couldn't speak. The pain in her wrist was a throbbing fire, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming mix of fear, relief, and a strange, burgeoning trust in this quiet, scarred man. All she could do was give him the smallest, most fleeting of nods. It was enough. In the dim, smoky back room of the saloon, unseen by the drama in the street, a man sat at a small, rickety table. It was the same wiry man who had poured the oil by the grain shed. On the wall in front of him, he had tacked up a rough, hand-drawn map of the town. With a piece of charcoal, he drew a large X over the Pike farm. Then, his grimy finger traced a line to a new location. He circled the largest building on the map, the town's central grain and hay cooperative, the one that served all the small farms, including the March parcel. Beside the circle, he wrote 2 words in crude, blocky letters: "Tonight, Granary." Night fell over Sagebrush Crossing not with peace, but with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The adrenaline from the day's chaos had long since faded, leaving behind aching muscles and frayed nerves. Eliza sat in her darkened shop, her bandaged wrist propped on a pillow, the throbbing a dull, constant reminder of the day's violence. Coulter was a mile out of town, his small campfire a lone spark of orange against the immense, dark canvas of the prairie. A fragile truce seemed to have settled over the land, the kind of quiet that comes after a fever has broken. But it was a deceptive peace. The predator was not sleeping. It was merely waiting for the deepest point of the night. The first sign was a flicker. an almost imperceptible pulse of orange light against the grimy window pane of the general store. A few moments later, the wind, which had been sighing fitfully all evening, shifted direction and picked up strength. It carried with it a new scent, not the clean smell of dust and sage, but the sharp, acrid bite of burning hay and old, dry pine. It was a smell of deliberate destruction. The fire began at the granary, not the small, private shed behind the Pike farm, but the large, communal one, where the handful of local farmers pooled their resources. It started low and fast, the oil-soaked foundation catching with a greedy, whooshing sound. The flames, starved for air, clawed their way up the inside of the walls, licking at the dry timber. For a few long minutes, the only sign was a growing, sickly orange glow that painted the undersides of the passing clouds. Then, with a percussive boom that shook the windows of the nearby church, a section of the roof gave way, and the fire roared into the night sky. A ravenous beast, finally unleashed. Coulter was on his feet before the sound had finished echoing. He had been watching the town, a strange, protective instinct keeping him awake. He saw the glow, heard the explosion, and knew, with a cold certainty that settled in his gut, that this was no accident. He threw his saddle on his mare, his movements economical and swift, and galloped toward the inferno, the wind whipping his face. The fire was a living thing, a monstrous, crackling entity that threw a shower of embers into the sky. And the wind, the same cruel wind that had scoured the town for weeks, was now its accomplice. It caught the flaming debris and carried it eastward, a fiery blizzard descending directly upon the cluster of small homesteads on the edge of town, directly upon the small clapboard house and seamstress shop owned by Eliza March. Coulter didn't ride to the fire. He rode to her. He vaulted from his saddle before the horse had even stopped and hammered on her door, his fist making a sound like a drumbeat of doom. "Eliza, wake up, fire." She was already awake, startled from a shallow, pain-ridden sleep by the explosion. She met him at the door, her face a pale oval in the flickering firelight, her good hand clutching a shawl around her shoulders. "The granary," she breathed, her eyes wide with horror. "The wind is carrying it this way," he said, his voice grim. "Get a bucket. Anything that will hold water. The well." There was no time for fear. Action was the only antidote. While other townsfolk began to emerge, their shouts a confused, panicked chorus, Coulter and Eliza became a focused, two-person army against the encroaching disaster. Coulter, using the raw power of his shoulders, kicked open the jammed door of the nearest empty shed to find two heavy wooden buckets. He ran to the town well, the pump handle groaning in protest as he worked it with a frantic energy, the water gushing into the buckets. Eliza, her injured wrist a screaming agony she forced herself to ignore, met him halfway. He thrust a full, sloshing bucket into her good hand, its weight nearly pulling her off her feet. "Wet the roof!" he yelled over the roar of the fire. "And the walls!" A bucket brigade of two began. He would draw the water, his muscles straining, and she would haul it, one-handed, to the side of her house, slinging the contents up onto the dry, thirsty shingles of her roof. The water hissed as it hit the wood, turning instantly to steam. It felt like a pitifully small effort against such a monstrous foe. Embers, some as large as a man's thumb, were beginning to land around them, glowing like angry red eyes in the grass. The smoke rolled in, a thick, choking blanket that burned their lungs and stung their eyes. It was a physical presence, a suffocating wall that stole the air and turned the world into a shadowy, orange-tinted hell. Eliza began to cough, deep, rasping coughs that shook her entire body. She stumbled, dizzy from the smoke and the pain. "Keep going," Coulter yelled, his voice rough with effort and smoke. He was beside her now, his own face black with soot, his eyes red-rimmed but fiercely focused, a large, flaming piece of timber from the granary roof carried on an updraft, cartwheeled through the air and crashed onto the roof of her shop. The dry shingles caught instantly. "The seed!" Eliza cried, her voice cracking with panic. "The seed grain for the planting is in the shed." It was everything she had left, the physical manifestation of any hope for a future. Coulter didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby axe. "Stay here," he commanded, but she was already moving with him. Together they ran to the small storage shed behind her shop, the flames on the main roof now beginning to spread. He swung the axe, the wood of the shed door splintering, and kicked it open. The smoke inside was even thicker, but they could see them two heavy burlap sacks leaning against the far wall. They represented a fortune. More than that, they represented survival. As Coulter lunged inside to grab the first sack, a shower of sparks rained down from the now burning eaves of the shop. One glowing cinder, bright and malevolent, drifted down in a lazy, terrifying spiral directly toward Eliza's head, threatening to ignite her hair. Coulter saw it. He dropped the axe and moved with a speed that seemed impossible. He tore his canvas coat from his shoulders and in one fluid motion flung it over her head, pulling her tight against his chest and shielding her with his own body. She felt the searing heat as the spark landed on the thick fabric of the coat, heard it hiss and die an inch from her hair. She was enveloped in darkness, the smell of him sage and smoke and sweat filling her senses, his arms a steel band around her. The moment lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. He released her. "The sacks," he said, his voice thick. They worked in a desperate, synchronized rhythm. He shouldered one sack, the muscles in his back and neck cording with the strain. She, using her one good arm and her entire body for leverage, managed to drag the second one out of the shed and into the relative safety of the open yard, just as a section of the shop's roof collapsed inward with a great, groaning sigh. They had saved them. 2 sacks. Enough to replant. Enough for a chance. They stood there for a moment, gasping for air, their chests heaving, their faces black with soot. They were alive. They had saved a small piece of the future. The rest of the town had now organized a proper bucket brigade, focusing their efforts on preventing the fire from spreading further. The immediate danger to Eliza's property, now that the granary was mostly a collapsed shell, seemed to be passing. It was then that Silas Dorn and Deputy Riggs arrived. They strolled up not with buckets, but with an air of official, detached authority. Dorn was, as always, impeccably dressed, his polished boots picking a careful path around the muddy puddles from the spilled water. Riggs had a notepad in his hand, though he seemed in no hurry to write anything down. "A terrible tragedy," Dorn said, his voice laced with a sympathy that was entirely false. He surveyed the smoldering ruin of the granary and the damage to Eliza's shop. "You have our deepest condolences, Mrs. March. Deputy Riggs will, of course, be conducting a full investigation." Riggs nodded lazily. "Appears to be a stray spark from the railroad work," he said, not even looking at the evidence. "A regrettable accident." He made a meaningless scribble on his notepad. A small, self-satisfied smirk was hidden in his thick mustache. He and Dorn exchanged a look, a fleeting glance of shared, corrupt understanding. Coulter watched them, his chest still heaving, a cold, hard rage building behind his exhaustion. He saw their clean clothes, their clean hands, their clean consciences. He looked from them to Eliza standing beside him, her face streaked with soot and tears, her dress singed at the hem, her arm held in its makeshift sling. The injustice of it was a physical weight. The moment was raw, stripped bare by fire and fear. The false composure of the world had been burned away, leaving only what was real. Coulter reached out, his soot-stained fingers gently touching her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smudge of ash. He looked into her eyes, and in their exhausted depths, he saw a reflection of his own weariness, his own loneliness. An overwhelming wave of tenderness and fierce protectiveness washed over him. He leaned in, his intention clear, his lips aiming not for hers, but for her forehead, a gesture of comfort, of respect, of a promise he couldn't yet name. She turned her head away at the last second. His lips brushed her temple instead. She didn't pull back in anger or disgust. It was a small, sad, weary movement. She looked at him, her eyes clear and steady despite her exhaustion. "When you're still running," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "Don't make promises." The words hung between them, more powerful than a physical blow. She wasn't rejecting him. She was stating a fact. He was a drifter, a man followed by fire and trouble. She was a woman anchored to a piece of land that was trying to kill her. A kiss, in that moment, would have been a promise, and she was a woman who knew the cost of broken promises. He straightened up, a muscle working in his jaw, and gave a slow, deep nod of understanding. She was right, as the first pale, gray light of dawn began to silhouette the smoldering ruins. Dorn and Riggs concluded their investigation and departed. The townsfolk began to drift back to their homes, leaving Coulter and Eliza alone in the field of ash. Coulter walked over to the foundation of the granary, his boots crunching on charred wood. His instincts were screaming at him. This wasn't an accident. He kicked at a pile of debris, his eyes scanning the ground, and then he saw it. Lying in the gray ash, partially protected by a fallen beam, was a small, oily piece of cord, a fuse. It was a professional demolition fuse, not something a farmer would have. He picked it up carefully. At the end of the cord was a small metal crimp, the kind used to attach a detonator. It was blackened by the fire, but as he rubbed the soot away with his thumb, he saw it. Stamped into the soft metal was a small, distinctive mark, a simple T intersected with a W, Texas Western. He held it in his palm, the small, damning piece of evidence. He looked over at Eliza, who had been watching him. He didn't have to say a word. He opened his hand. She walked over, her eyes following his gaze down to the object in his palm. She leaned in closer, her focus narrowing. Her eyes, which a moment ago had been clouded with exhaustion, suddenly became sharp, bright, and focused, like her finest needle finding the eye in a piece of thread. The exhaustion was replaced by a cold, clear certainty. She understood. They looked at each other over the ruins, a new, unspoken alliance forged in the ashes. "The water ditch," he said, his voice a low growl. "They stopped the water to make the land worthless. The fire is to scare everyone off before the auction." "They'll be back," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "to make sure the ditch stays blocked. Tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. "We'll be waiting for them." He walked her back to what was left of her porch. As he turned to leave, his hand brushed his coat pocket and he felt the hard, dented shape of the music box. He pulled it out. The fall in the street had jammed it again. The promise to fix it was still unkept. The melody of home was still broken. He looked at it, then at her, and the silence between them was filled with everything that still needed to be mended. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, offering little light and no comfort. A low-hanging mist, born from the subtle shift in temperature between the hot day and the cool night, clung to the ground, muffling sound and soaking everything in a fine, clammy dew. The world was reduced to shades of gray and black, a landscape of ghosts. In the heart of this spectral world, nestled in the bitter-smelling embrace of a large sagebrush, two figures kept a silent vigil. Eliza sat with her back against the rough, woody trunk of the bush, her good hand wrapped around her injured wrist. The makeshift bandage Coulter had fashioned from his coat lining was still there, but a deep, throbbing ache had settled into her bones. Every beat of her heart was a fresh wave of pain. She ignored it. She had learned long ago that some pain simply had to be endured, walled off in a separate part of the mind while the business of survival continued. Her focus was on the irrigation ditch, a dark, empty scar in the moonlight a dozen yards away. Coulter was a study in stillness beside her. He wasn't sitting, but crouched on the balls of his feet, a position he could likely hold for hours without complaint. He was a creature of the night, his senses tuned to its subtle language. He missed nothing: the frantic, sawing song of the crickets, the whisper of the wind through the dry grass, the distant, lonely call of a hunting owl. He had insisted she take his coat again, and its familiar weight and scent were a small, solid anchor in the vast, uncertain darkness. The torn lining where he'd ripped the bandage from was a tangible link to the violence of the day, and to his unexpected tenderness. They didn't speak. Words were a liability, a clumsy noise that could carry on the damp air. Their communication was in the slight shift of weight, the turn of a head, the shared, steady intake of breath. They were two separate, wounded people who had, through circumstance, become a single, watchful entity. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, gratitude, fear, a fragile and growing trust that neither of them was ready to name. An hour crept by, then another. The moon climbed higher, its light growing colder, sharper, just as Eliza was beginning to think they had been wrong. A sound reached them, carried on the wind. It was the soft clink of metal on rock, followed by the low, guttural murmur of men's voices. Coulter's body tensed, a subtle tightening of muscle that communicated itself to her as clearly as a spoken word. He put a hand on her arm, a silent command to stay absolutely still. 4 figures emerged from the gloom, moving with a practiced, furtive confidence. They were silhouettes, bulky and graceless, carrying heavy sacks over their shoulders. They moved directly to the main junction of the ditch, where a crude, wooden sluice gate controlled the flow of water or wood, if there had been any water to control. The men worked with a grim efficiency, their movements illuminated by the brief, shielded flare of a match lighting a cheap cigar. They began to block the main channel, the one that led to the farms. They heaved the heavy sandbags into the ditch, the sacks landing with soft, heavy thuds that seemed to shake the very ground. They were building a dam, a crude but effective barrier. Once the main channel was blocked, 2 of the men strained against a large lever. With a groan of protesting wood, they opened a secondary sluice gate, one that led to a newer, deeper channel Eliza had never seen before. A channel that cut directly east, toward the vast, empty parcel of land that Silas Dorn had recently acquired for the railroad. They were not just stopping the water, they were stealing it. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it. This was the proof. It wasn't just negligence, it was a deliberate, calculated act of sabotage. While the men worked, their backs to them, she acted. Her mind, accustomed to patterns and plans, saw the scene not as a threat, but as a map that needed to be recorded. She picked up a small, sharp stick. In the damp, soft earth at the base of the sagebrush, she began to draw. Her good hand moved with a seamstress's precision. She drew a line for the main ditch, a crosshatch for the sandbag dam, a second, branching line for the illegal channel, an arrow indicating the direction of the water's flow, and a small, square shape with a D inside it, representing Dorn's reservoir. It was a simple damming diagram, a story told in mud. Coulter watched her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. While she recorded the crime, he prepared to undo it. He drew a long, sharp knife from the sheath on his belt, its blade catching a faint sliver of moonlight. He wasn't going to fight them. Not yet. The plan was to create confusion, to remove the evidence of their work. He looked at her, his eyes asking a silent question. She met his gaze and gave a single, firm nod. As he prepared to move, she remembered the other piece of evidence. She reached into her apron pocket and her fingers closed around the oily, grimy length of the fuse cord. The metal crimp with its TW stamp felt cold against her skin. It was too important to lose, too vital to drop in a struggle. With her teeth and her one good hand, she painstakingly tied the cord around her uninjured wrist, knotting it tightly. It was a grim bracelet, a commitment to a truth that might very well get her killed. The knot was secure, her evidence was safe. Coulter moved. He didn't rise, but flattened himself to the ground, moving on his belly like a snake. He used the shadows and the low brush for cover, his progress agonizingly slow but utterly silent. The men at the ditch were grunting with their final efforts, their attention focused on their work. He reached the edge of the ditch, just downstream from their dam. His knife flashed. He didn't slash at the heavy burlap sacks, he went for the seams, slicing the twine that held them together. The coarse thread parted, and with a soft, rustling hiss, sand began to pour from the bottom of the bags. He worked his way down the line, slitting bag after bag. He was an agent of entropy, quietly unmaking their work, letting the stolen sand bleed back into the earth. He was on the 3rd bag when one of the men paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He turned, his gaze sweeping the darkness. It was a casual, thoughtless glance, but his eyes snagged on a flicker of movement, the pale glint of Coulter's knife in the moonlight. "Hey!" the man barked, his voice a harsh croak. "What the hell?" The quiet of the night shattered. Coulter was on his feet in an instant, the knife held low and ready. The other three men spun around, their faces a mixture of surprise and feral anger. The one who had spotted him, a big bearded man with a gut that strained the buttons of his shirt, pulled a long, wicked-looking skinning knife from his belt. "Got ourselves a spy," he snarled, advancing on Coulter. It was the distraction they needed. As two of the men moved to flank Coulter, the third, a wiry, rat-faced man, noticed the movement from the sagebrush as Eliza rose to her feet. He changed direction, a low growl in his throat, and came for her. He was fast. He closed the distance in a few short strides, his hand reaching for her. But Eliza was not the same woman who had been frozen by a stampeding horse. The fire and the fear had burned away some of her hesitation, leaving behind a core of hard, unyielding resolve. In her good hand, she clutched a heavy, polished piece of wood she had brought from her shop, a weaver's shuttle, dense and smooth, weighted with lead. As the man's hand shot out to grab her, she swung it in a short, vicious arc, putting all of her weight and desperation behind the blow. The shuttle connected squarely with his outstretched wrist with a sickening, wet crack. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and stumbled back, clutching his broken arm. At the same time, the big man lunged at Coulter. A knife blade flashed, arcing toward Coulter's ribs. Coulter moved with a dancer's grace, turning his body so the blade slid past him, and brought the pommel of his own knife up in a hard, sharp jab that caught the man under the chin. The man's head snapped back, his teeth clacking together, and he staggered, momentarily dazed. But they were still outnumbered. The other two were closing in. It was a fight they could not win. "Hold it right there, Hale." The voice was loud, authoritative, and sickeningly familiar. Deputy Riggs stepped out from behind a stand of cottonwood trees, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. But it wasn't pointed at the four thugs. It was pointed squarely at Coulter's chest. The two remaining henchmen grinned, relaxing their stance. The fight was over. The law had arrived, and it was on their side. "Well, well," Riggs said, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He sauntered forward, his tarnished star glinting. "Looks like we caught our arsonist and our water thief." He gestured with the shotgun toward the slit sandbags. "Trying to sabotage Mr. Dorn's property. Were you tisk? "Riggs, you know damn well what's happening here," Coulter growled, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "All I know is what I see," the deputy said smoothly. "And I see you and this woman trespassing and destroying private property." He jerked his head at one of the men. "Cuff him." One of the thugs pulled a set of iron manacles from his belt and advanced on Coulter, a sneer on his face. Coulter stood his ground, his body radiating a defiance that was both magnificent and futile. Riggs took a step toward Eliza, his eyes filled with contempt. "As for you, Mrs. March, you're becoming a real nuisance." He reached out and shoved her. Hard. The push was casual, dismissive, but it sent her stumbling backward. She tripped on the uneven ground and fell, her injured wrist hitting the dirt with a jolt of fresh, searing pain. In that instant of chaos, as all eyes were on Coulter bracing for the cuffs, Eliza acted. This was their only chance. Coulter was being taken, but he was her only hope, with a single, desperate, fluid motion. She scrambled closer to him. Her good hand darted out. She knew the feel of his coat intimately. Her fingers found the torn lining, the small hole he had ripped to make her bandage. She untied the fuse from her wrist in a single, practiced pull. She shoved the oily cord and its metal crimp deep inside the lining of his coat, a secret hidden within a wound. As her hand brushed his side, she leaned in, her lips close to his ear, the world narrowing to this one, final, desperate act of faith. "If you break me," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread of sound, "you fix me." It was a prayer, a command, and a promise, all at once. He gave a barely perceptible nod, his eyes never leaving hers. As the cold iron of the manacles snapped shut around his wrists, the bond between them was sealed, just as they were torn apart. The thugs hauled Coulter to his feet. Riggs gave Eliza one last kick of dirt with his boot. "Go on, get out of here," he snarled. "Go home and cry about your bad luck." They began to march Coulter away, a prisoner of a corrupt law, disappearing into the darkness. Eliza was left alone, kneeling in the damp earth, the diagram in the mud already beginning to lose its shape. Pain, fear, and a burning, righteous fury warred within her. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. Riggs had made a mistake. He had let her go. She pushed herself to her feet, her body screaming in protest. She had to run. She couldn't go to the sheriff, who was in Dorn's pocket. She needed someone with moral authority, someone the town might still listen to. The minister, and Judge Miller, the traveling circuit judge who was in town for the week, staying in the room behind the church. She began to run, stumbling through the darkness, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She ran with a purpose she had not felt in years. She was no longer a victim being swept away by the flood. She was a runner in a race for a man's life, and for the soul of her town. As her feet pounded the dirt path leading back to the faint lights of Sagebrush Crossing, the jostling of her movement shook the small music box in her apron pocket. The broken mechanism, jarred by her desperate flight, clicked, and from the depths of her pocket, a single, clear, tinny note chimed out the last, stuck note of Home Sweet Home. It was a tiny, hopeful sound in the vast, oppressive night, a small, stubborn promise, shining in the dark. The sun rose on a town holding its breath. By 8 o'clock, the news had spread not on the wind, but through the anxious, hurried whispers of neighbors. There was to be a hearing, not in a proper courthouse, for Sagebrush Crossing had none, but in the church. The house of God was to become a house of judgment. They came in a slow, uncertain trickle at first, then in a steady stream, farmers with the red dust of their failing fields etched into the lines on their faces. The blacksmith with his powerful arms crossed over his leather apron, the shopkeepers and their wives, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and a dangerous, burgeoning curiosity. They filled the hard wooden pews, their Sunday best looking out of place on a weekday morning. They were a congregation of the worried and the wronged, and they spilled out onto the church steps and into the dusty yard, their collective murmur a low, humming thing, like bees in a threatened hive. At the front, where the pulpit usually stood, a simple pine table had been placed. Behind it sat Judge Harlan Miller, a circuit judge whose arrival in town for the week was a stroke of what some were already calling divine providence. He was a man in his 60s, with a face like a worn map and eyes that had seen too much human folly to be easily impressed or intimidated. He wore a rumpled black suit, not robes, but he carried with him an aura of unshakable, weary authority. To his left sat the Reverend Davies, his Bible closed before him, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Silas Dorn and Deputy Riggs stood to one side, a portrait of confident authority. Dorn was immaculate, his dark suit a stark rebuke to the dust and desperation around him. He held a leather folio in his hands and surveyed the assembled crowd with a look of mild, paternalistic amusement, as if observing a charming, if slightly unruly, school play. Riggs stood beside him, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his expression a practiced sneer. Then the side door opened, and a collective, indrawn breath seemed to suck the air from the room. Two of Dorn's hired men, the same thugs from the ditch, escorted Coulter Hale to the front. His hands were bound before him with a length of rope. His face was bruised and streaked with dirt, his clothes torn. But he stood tall, his pale eyes sweeping the room once before coming to rest on the main entrance. He was waiting. He didn't have to wait long. Eliza March walked through the doors, and a path seemed to open for her. She was not the same woman who had fumbled with a music box or crumpled in the street. Her dress was clean but simple. Her hair was pulled back severely, and the makeshift bandage was still wrapped around her swollen wrist. She walked with a straight-backed purpose that silenced the murmurs. She looked neither left nor right. She walked to the front of the church and stood alone, facing the judge's table. She stood as straight and unbending as one of her own sewing needles. Coulter's eyes fixed on her, and for the first time since he'd been brought in, the hard lines around his mouth softened, just for an instant. "Let's begin," Judge Miller said, his voice a gravelly rumble that cut through the tension. "This is not a formal trial. It is an inquiry, held in public, because the matters at hand affect the public. Mr. Dorn, you and Deputy Riggs have leveled serious charges against Mr. Hale. State them, plainly." Dorn stepped forward, his polished boots making a confident, solid sound on the floorboards. He opened his folio and produced a document with a flourish. "Your Honor, the matter is quite simple. The law is the law. This is a loan agreement between the Sagebrush Bank Trust, which I represent in this matter, and the late Daniel March for the parcel of land known as Coyote Bend. The loan is in arrears. The payments are delinquent." He placed the contract on the table. "As per the terms, the property is forfeit and scheduled for public auction. That is a matter of legal fact." He paused, letting the weight of the document settle. "Furthermore," he continued, gesturing toward Coulter, "this man, Coulter Hale, was apprehended by a sworn officer of the law last night in the act of trespassing and destroying property belonging to the Texas Western Railroad, namely, a series of sandbags vital for survey and grading work. He is a drifter, a known troublemaker, and it is our belief he started the fire at the granary to create a panic and cover his other illegal activities." His voice was smooth, reasonable. To many in the pews, it sounded like the irrefutable voice of progress and order. "Mrs. March," the judge said, turning his gaze to her, "your response." Eliza took a step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as clear and steady as a church bell on a calm morning. "The law is the law, Mr. Dorn, but the truth is the truth." She looked directly at the judge. "My husband's debt is real. The drought that has made it impossible to pay is also real, but that is not the whole story." She reached into her apron pocket with her good hand and produced a folded piece of paper. "This is the whole story," she said, unfolding it and placing it on the table beside Dorn's contract. It was a simple, clean drawing of the irrigation ditch, the dam, and the second channel leading to Dorn's land. "Last night, Mr. Hale and I witnessed 4 of Mr. Dorn's men blocking the public ditch and illegally diverting our water to Mr. Dorn's private reservoir. This is why our crops are dying. This is why the land is worthless. This is why the bank can foreclose." A wave of murmurs rippled through the church. Farmer Pike, a man whose face was a mask of despair, shot to his feet. "It's true the ditch is blocked. I saw the new channel myself." "Order," the judge said, his voice sharp, but he let Pike remain standing. Dorn scoffed, a sound of pure dismissal. "The scribblings of a desperate woman. She has no proof." "Oh, but I do," Eliza said, her voice dropping, drawing everyone in. "They used a fuse to start the fire at the granary, a professional fuse." She looked at Coulter, then back at the judge. "When Deputy Riggs arrested Mr. Hale, he was in possession of that fuse. It had a maker's mark on it, a T and a W for the Texas Western Company." All eyes swung to Deputy Riggs. A single bead of sweat broke on his forehead and traced a slow path down his temple. His sneer was gone, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed look of panic. "Is this true?" Deputy, the judge asked, his eyes narrowing. "Did you collect this evidence?" Riggs swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Yes, Your Honor. But it don't prove nothing. Could have been planted." He fumbled in his coat pocket, his hand shaking slightly. "Then let's look at the supplier," Reverend Davies said, speaking for the first time. His voice was calm but carried the weight of moral conviction. All eyes turned to him. "The Texas Western Railroad, through its local contractor, a Mr. Shanklin, recently donated some surplus lumber to the church for repairs. I have the invoice." He slid a piece of paper across the table. "Mr. Shanklin's supply company has the sole contract for providing all materials to the railroad in this territory. His mark, a TW inside a circle, is on this invoice, and it was on the crates of blasting supplies I saw him unloading for the railroad crew last week. The chain was complete." The fuse for the fire came from the railroad's contractor. The pieces clicked into place with an audible, collective gasp from the pews. Deputy Riggs began to sweat in earnest now. The collar of his uniform seemed to be choking him. He tugged at it with a thick finger. He couldn't meet the judge's gaze. He looked at Dorn, a desperate, pleading look. Dorn's confident smile had vanished, replaced by a thin, bloodless line. Coulter Hale had not moved. He stood with his hands bound, his gaze fixed on Eliza. He looked at her not as a man watching his rescuer, but as a man watching a force of nature he had known was there all along. He was a silent, powerful testament to his faith in her. Judge Miller steepled his fingers and stared at the two documents on the table, Dorn's legal contract and Eliza's map of a crime. "We have a case of illegal debt," he said slowly, "and a compelling accusation of conspiracy, sabotage, and arson designed to enforce that debt." He fixed his gaze on Dorn. "These are serious claims, supported by circumstantial evidence and a credible witness." He picked up his gavel. "Therefore, I am ordering a stay. The auction of the Coyote Bend parcel is postponed for a period of 7 days." The gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack. "In that time, I will personally inspect the irrigation ditch, the dam, and this alleged reservoir, Deputy Riggs," he said, his voice dropping to an icy calm. "You will provide me with that fuse for examination, and you will provide me with a full account of your actions last night. Do you understand me?" Riggs could only nod, his face the color of wet ash. Dorn stepped forward, his composure cracking, a vein throbbing in his temple. "This is an outrage, an affront to the law. This town is full of squatters and deadbeats. It needs to be brought into the modern age." His eyes, burning with a cold fury, found Coulter's. "Sometimes, to build something new, you have to clear out the trash." The threat was naked, public, and directed at one man. A low growl rumbled through the crowd. This time, it wasn't just Farmer Pike. The blacksmith took a half step into the aisle. Several other men got to their feet. For the first time, they were not just looking at Silas Dorn, they were staring him down. His power, which had seemed so absolute an hour ago, was beginning to fray at the edges. "This inquiry is concluded," the judge said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Mr. Hale will be held in the town's custody, under my personal authority, pending the investigation. He is not to be harmed." He looked pointedly at Riggs, who flinched. Dorn's men moved to escort Coulter to the small holding cell behind the sheriff's office. As they passed Eliza, he paused, his eyes meeting hers. There were a dozen things to say, a world of gratitude and fear and hope, but the guards were between them, a physical barrier. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod, and then he was gone. Eliza watched him go, her body trembling with the release of tension. The townspeople began to file out, talking in low, excited voices, their fear replaced by a new, dangerous energy. She was left standing alone at the front of the empty church. She walked to the table where Dorn's contract and her hand-drawn map still lay. She picked up neither. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket and took out the small maple music box. It was dented and scarred, a veteran of the town's silent war. She placed it gently on the table, in the spot where the morning sun streamed through the stained glass window, creating a pool of colored light. With her good hand, she reached out and turned the small, winding key. There was no hesitation, no scrape of metal. The mechanism caught, the cylinder turned, and the clear, tinny, hopeful notes of Home Sweet Home filled the silent church. It played through from beginning to end, every note perfect, every note true. It was a promise, kept. It was a statement, made. The music was whole, and in the quiet, sun-dusted church, it sounded like the beginning of a fight. The quiet that followed the hearing was not peace. It was the heavy, breathless calm that comes before a storm breaks. For 3 days, Sagebrush Crossing waited. Judge Miller, a man true to his word, rode out with the Reverend and a grim-faced Farmer Pike to inspect the irrigation ditch. They returned covered in mud, their faces set like stone, and said nothing. Silas Dorn remained sequestered in the saloon, holding court with his hired men, the air around him thick with arrogance and menace. Coulter sat in the town's single, dusty jail cell, a silent, caged wolf, watching the sky through the small, barred window. On the afternoon of the fourth day, the sky began to change. The relentless, pale blue was swallowed by a bruised, purple gray that rolled in from the west. The air grew thick, heavy, tasting of electricity and damp earth. There was no wind. The world seemed to be holding its breath. And then the storm did not arrive. It fell. It began without warning, not with a gentle patter, but with a sudden, violent deluge, as if the sky had simply torn open. Fat, heavy drops of water the size of bullets hammered the tin roofs, turning the dusty street into a churning, brown river in a matter of minutes. It was the first real rain of the season, a gift the parched land had been praying for, but it came with a wild, biblical fury. With the rain came the thunder. It wasn't a distant rumble, but a sharp, deafening crack that split the world, followed instantly by a flash of lightning that bleached the landscape white. For the cattle in Coulter's herd, penned in a temporary corral just outside of town, it was a terrifying, elemental assault. They were creatures of the open plain, and the claustrophobic fury of the storm, the noise, the flashes of light, drove them mad with a primal fear. A low, rumbling groan rose from the herd, a sound of 1,000 gathering panics. Another bolt of lightning struck a tall cottonwood near the corral, showering the ground with sparks and the smell of ozone. That was the final trigger. The collective fear exploded into a single, mindless, irresistible urge run. The flimsy wooden fence of the corral didn't stand a chance. It splintered with a sound like a volley of gunshots, and the herd surged forth. It was not a group of animals. It was a force of nature, a river of horns and hooves and blind terror, a solid, thundering wave of brown and black that poured directly toward the main street of Sagebrush Crossing. The town dissolved into chaos, hooves churning the street into a brown soup. Shouts. The splintering of a cart that was overturned by the leading edge of the stampede. People ran for cover, pressing themselves into doorways, their faces white with terror. From the covered porch of the saloon, Silas Dorn watched, a thin, cruel smile on his lips. This was not a disaster to him, it was an opportunity. As the panicked river of cattle flowed into the town, he gave a sharp, subtle nod. 4 of his men, who had been waiting for the signal, sprang into action. They emerged from the alleyways, flapping slickers and shouting, not to turn the herd away from the town, but to funnel it. They were expertly guiding the panic, steering the deadly torrent of animals away from the center of town and directly toward the new graded rail bed at the eastern edge. Their plan was as simple as it was vicious: let the stampede tear up the ties, destroy the grading, and then blame the entire thing on Coulter Hale. Sabotage of the railroad, a federal offense. It would be enough to see him hang, and it would crush the town's fledgling spirit of defiance for good. From his cell, Coulter heard the thunder of the hooves, a sound he knew better than his own heartbeat. He saw the first of the terrified longhorns surge past his window. He knew what was happening. He also knew what Dorn would do. He put his shoulder to the flimsy wooden door of his cell. The old lock, meant to hold a common drunk, not a desperate, powerful man, groaned. He hit it again. The wood splintered. On the third try, the jam shattered, and he was free. He burst out into the storm, the cold rain a shock against his skin. His mare was tied at the hitching post where he'd left her. There was no time for a saddle, no time for a bridle. He grabbed a handful of mane, swung himself onto her bare, wet back, and with his knees and a low command, sent her plunging into the maelstrom. Eliza saw it all from the window of her shop. She saw the cattle, she saw Dorn's men steering them, and she saw Coulter, a figure of impossible, wild courage, riding bareback into the heart of the chaos. Her heart seized with a terror that was colder than the rain. She knew what he was trying to do. She also knew he couldn't do it alone. Her eyes darted around her shop, searching. They landed on a new bolt of white muslin, fabric for a wedding dress she was supposed to start. Without a second's hesitation, she grabbed her cutting shears, her injured wrist screaming in protest. and sliced off a huge length of the cloth. Tying it to the end of a long broom handle, she created a makeshift flag. She ran out into the storm, a small, solitary figure of defiance against the thundering herd. Coulter was a master, even bareback, even in the mud. He was a dervish of controlled energy, his horse weaving through the stampede, him leaning low, shouting, slapping the rumps of the lead steers, trying to turn them, to break their momentum. But Dorn's men were working against him, their presence on the flank keeping the herd pointed squarely at the railroad tracks. Then they saw Eliza. She was planting herself at the crucial turning point, right before the Bentswater crossing, the last chance to divert the herd away from the rails. She began waving the large white flag, a beacon of startling white in the gray, chaotic world. A led steer, its eyes rolling in terror, saw the strange, flapping shape and veered away from it. Another followed, then another. The river of cattle began to bend, to curve away from the tracks and toward the relative safety of the open pasture beyond the town. It was working. But Deputy Riggs saw it, too. He burst out of the sheriff's office, his face purple with rage, his authority shattered. He saw Coulter, the escaped prisoner. He saw Eliza, the source of all his trouble. He raised his pistol, the barrel looking like a black, hollow eye in the rain. "Hale, you're finished!" he screamed, his voice nearly lost in the storm. "Stop right there." He was aiming at Coulter, but Eliza saw the gun. Without a thought for her own safety, she ran and planted herself directly in front of Coulter's horse, shielding him with her small frame. She stood between the lawman's gun and the man she would not let die. Her shoulders were trembling, but her back was straight. For Coulter, the world narrowed to that single image Eliza, soaked and defiant, offering her life for his. It broke something open inside him. The time for running was over. The time for promises was now. His hand went to his chest, to the last button, the one that held the tattered remnants of his coat together, the one she had sewn back on with strong, careful stitches. A sharp tug. The threads snapped. He tore the garment from his body. It was more than a coat. It was his last wall, his final defense. With a powerful rip, he tore the heavy canvas nearly in two, creating a massive, ragged banner. Leaning low from his horse's back, he used it like a matador's cape, a huge, flapping shape that was far more imposing than Eliza's flag. He swept it in front of the lead steers. The last, stubborn remnants of the herd saw the terrifying, flapping monster and broke, turning hard, following the others away from the tracks, their hooves thundering past the Bentswater and into the safety of the open land. At that exact moment, the sky unleashed its full fury. A bolt of lightning, jagged and brilliant, did not hit the prairie, but a tall, newly erected signal post right beside the railroad tracks. There was a sound like a giant whip crack, an explosion of splintering wood and a shower of blue sparks. A heavy, iron test car that had been left on a slight incline, its brake chocks loosened by the torrential rain, began to slide. It moved slowly at first, then gathered speed, rolling silently down the track, a runaway ghost of Dorn's ambition. Silas Dorn, watching from the porch, saw the lightning strike his signal post. He saw his test car begin to slide. For the first time, his mask of cold control shattered. A look of pure animal panic crossed his face. His railroad, his perfect, orderly symbol of power, was being destroyed by the very chaos he had tried to harness. One of his men, the foreman, a man named Shanklin who had been pushed to the breaking point, saw the panic in his employer's eyes. The fear, the guilt, the pressure of the last week, it all erupted out of him in a single, ragged scream directed at Dorn. "I told you this was crazy," he shrieked, his voice high and thin against the storm. "The order to block the ditch was yours. You said it would be easy. You said no one would get hurt." The confession, torn from him by terror, rang out across the now quieter square, and it did not fall on deaf ears. Stepping out from the deep doorway of the church, where they had taken shelter from the storm, were Judge Miller and Reverend Davies. They had seen the stampede. They had seen Eliza's courage and Coulter's sacrifice, and they had heard every single damning word. The stampede was over. The rain began to soften, its fury spent. Coulter slid from his horse's back, his legs shaking with adrenaline. The ruined halves of his coat were still in his hand. He walked to Eliza, who stood trembling, the crisis finally over. He said nothing. He simply draped the heavy, soaking wet pieces of canvas over her shoulders, pulling her into the shelter of his side. The wet wool was a poor shield against the rain, but it was a perfect shield against the world. He held the reins of his horse in one hand and her under his arm with the other. They stood there in the mud and the rain, watching as Judge Miller walked slowly, deliberately, toward a suddenly very pale Silas Dorn. Coulter and Eliza didn't need to speak. Their eyes, locked on each other's, said everything. The promises had been made. The debts were about to be paid. The rain softened to a whisper. The thunder of the stampede was gone, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic dripping of water from the eaves of the saloon, in the sudden, profound quiet. Shanklin's shrieked confession hung in the air, a raw, undeniable truth. Every eye in the muddy street was fixed on the tableau, the terrified foreman, the stunned judge, and Silas Dorn, whose face had become a mask of chalky, condensed fury. Judge Miller's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the damp air with the chilling precision of an icicle. "Mr. Shanklin," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, "I suggest you repeat what you just said, and this time, I suggest you leave nothing out." But Shanklin was broken. He could only stare at Dorn, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who has betrayed a dangerous master. It was Dorn who recovered first, his mask of control snapping back into place, albeit with visible cracks. "The man is hysterical," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "Driven mad by the storm, his words are meaningless." He started to turn away, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "I don't think so," the judge said, his voice stopping Dorn in his tracks. He pointed a weathered finger at the foreman. "That man's terror is the most honest thing I've seen in this town all week." The judge's gaze then shifted, locking onto Dorn. "And I have found that terror often loosens more than just the tongue." His eyes flickered to the small, leather-bound notebook that was visible in the inner pocket of Dorn's suit jacket. In his panic at the runaway railcar, Dorn had clutched his chest, and the notebook had been jostled partially free. A few pages, soaked by the driving rain, were sticking out. "Your ledger, Mr. Dorn," the judge said, his voice flat and hard as a blacksmith's anvil. "The one you are so rarely seen without? I would like to see it." "This is my private property," Dorn snarled, his hand instinctively moving to cover the book. "You have no right." "Under territorial law, in the investigation of a felony, and arson is most certainly a felony, I have every right to examine any and all potential evidence," the judge retorted. "Hand it over, or I will have you restrained and take it myself." For a long, tense moment, Dorn stood his ground, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical force. The town watched, silent, motionless. They were seeing the wolf shed its sheep's clothing. Finally, with a gesture of supreme, theatrical contempt, Dorn pulled the notebook from his pocket and threw it onto the muddy ground at the judge's feet. "Read it and be damned," he spat. Reverend Davies bent down and picked up the book, handling it as if it were a venomous snake. He wiped the mud from the cover with his sleeve and handed it to the judge. The leather was soaked, the pages warped and wavy from the rain. The ink, a severe, spidery black, had bled in places, but it was a high-quality, oil-based ink. It was still legible. Judge Miller opened the book. The silence in the street was absolute, broken only by the dripping rain. He didn't read it to himself. He read it aloud, his voice a clear, tolling bell of judgment, each entry a hammer blow nailing the lid on Silas Dorn's coffin. "Page 42, the judge began. "Payment to Deputy T. Riggs $20 for services rendered in community relations, dated the day after Mr. Hale's arrival." He flipped a page. "Page 45, disbursement for survey supplies $150. Noted in the margin, 50 sandbags, 20 lengths of rope." The same date the irrigation ditch ran dry. He turned another page, the damp paper making a soft, tearing sound. "Page 47, Contingency planning. Entry reads March property auction set. Potential for local resistance. Hail a complicating factor. Must be neutralized. Fire is a useful tool for creating chaos and assigning blame. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was all there. A meticulous, arrogant chronicle of his crimes. The judge looked up from the book, his eyes finding Deputy Riggs, who seemed to be shrinking inside his uniform. "Deputy Riggs," the judge said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Take off your badge." Riggs stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "Your Honor, you were just an accomplice to arson, sabotage, and conspiracy to defraud." The judge finished for him, his voice like chipping stone. "Take it off, now." With a hand that trembled so violently he could barely manage the clasp, Riggs unpinned the tarnished silver star from his chest. The symbol of his authority, of his betrayal, lay in his palm. He held it for a moment, then his hand opened and it fell, landing with a soft, final splash in a muddy puddle. "Mr. Pike," the judge called out, his gaze finding the farmer in the crowd. "Take 2 men you trust. Arrest this man. Use his own cuffs." Farmer Pike, a man who had been stooped with despair for weeks, seemed to grow a foot taller. He strode forward, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He and the blacksmith took Riggs by the arms. Riggs didn't struggle. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the hollow, sick certainty of his ruin. The town watched as he was led away, a prisoner in the town he was sworn to protect. No one cheered. A long, slow, collective sigh seemed to rise from the crowd, a sound of a pressure, long born, finally being released. The judge did not pause. His voice rang out again. "I am signing an official order, effective immediately. The illegal dam on the public ditch is to be dismantled. The reservoir on the property of the Texas Western Railroad is hereby seized as an asset in a criminal enterprise." He looked at the farmers. "The water belongs to you. Go and take it back." A ragged cheer did go up then, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. A dozen men, Pike among them, ran for shovels and axes, their weariness forgotten, their faces alight with a fierce, determined hope. They ran toward the ditch, a small army marching to reclaim their own lives. Judge Miller turned his attention back to the matter at hand. He looked at Silas Dorn, who stood alone now, his hired thugs having melted away into the crowd. "Mr. Dorn, this territory finds that you have acted with malice and criminal intent. Your project in this county is hereby suspended. A fine of $10,000 will be levied against the Texas Western Railroad, payable to the community of Sagebrush Crossing for damages and reconstruction. You have 24 hours to be gone from this jurisdiction." Then, the judge's gaze softened as he looked at Eliza, who stood beside Coulter, sheltered by the ruined pieces of his coat. "Mrs. March," he said, his voice gentle now, "the auction of your property is canceled, indefinitely." He reached into his own coat and produced a folded, official-looking document. It was her deed, which the bank had been holding. He walked over and placed it in her hand. "The court also rules that your loan payments are to be deferred, without penalty, until such time as a full harvest can be brought in from the newly watered land." Eliza looked down at the paper in her hand, the deed to her home, to her land, to her future. Her hand was trembling from the pain in her wrist and the emotional upheaval of the day, but her fingers held the document with an unshakable, steady strength. "And as for you, Mr. Hale," the judge said, turning to Coulter. He nodded to the blacksmith. "Cut him loose." The blacksmith produced a small, sharp knife and in one swift motion sliced through the ropes that bound Coulter's wrists. The cut ends fell away. Coulter stood there for a moment, his hands free for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He rubbed his chafed wrists, looking down at his own hands as if they were unfamiliar tools he no longer knew how to use. His fight was over. His purpose, for now, was fulfilled. He seemed adrift, a man of action with no immediate action to take. Dorn, defeated and disgraced, was escorted to the saloon to arrange his affairs, a man already a ghost in the town he had tried to own. The work of healing began almost immediately. As the rain finally stopped and a watery sun began to break through the clouds, People emerged. They didn't just go back to their homes. They began to gather. Someone started a collection, not of money, but of seed. A handful of beans from one family, a small pouch of corn from another. By nightfall, a sizable pile had been gathered to replace what had been lost in the fire. The next morning, a group of volunteers, with brooms and shovels, began the long, hard work of sweeping the black, greasy ash from the floor of the ruined granary. It was a baptism of work, a cleansing of a wound. That evening, as a soft, clean-smelling twilight settled over the town, Eliza and Coulter found themselves drawn back to the one place that felt like the beginning and the end of it all, the church. The door was open. The room was empty, filled with a peaceful, dusty silence. And there, on the pine table at the front, was the small maple music box, sitting exactly where she had left it. A warm, golden beam of the setting sun fell upon it. Eliza walked toward it. Her steps were sure, no longer hesitant. She stood before the table and looked at the box, at its dents and scars, a mirror of their own. She looked at Coulter, who had followed her, his freed hands now resting awkwardly at his sides. He gave her a small, quiet smile. She reached out with her good hand and turned the winding key. The notes of Home Sweet Home rose into the quiet air, clear and perfect. The melody was no longer a question or a broken plea. It was a statement. A quiet, certain, and unbreakable fact. The music played, and the town, for the first time in a very long time, began to feel like home. The world was washed clean. The storm had broken the fever of the drought and the tyranny of Silas Dorn in one clean sweep. In the days that followed, the air itself felt different, lighter, scrubbed clean of its dusty, oppressive weight. The main irrigation ditch, cleared of its illegal dam by a dozen triumphant farmers, now gurgled with a sound the town had almost forgotten. It was the sound of life. The water, brown and rich with mountain soil, flowed back into the parched fields, and almost overnight, a miracle occurred. Tiny, brilliant green shoots of grass, seeds that had lain dormant and waiting, began to push their way up through the cracked earth, a fragile but determined promise of renewal. The sun was warm and gentle, the sky a high, peaceful blue. Coulter had spent the morning helping Farmer Pike reinforce the fence on his small pasture, the easy rhythm of the work a welcome balm after the chaos. He walked back toward town in the late afternoon, his boots making soft sounds on the damp, firm earth. He was heading for the small room behind the jail he'd been allowed to use, but his steps, of their own accord, slowed as he approached Eliza March's shop. She was waiting for him. She sat on the small wooden bench outside her door, a heavy, familiar object folded neatly in her lap. It was his coat. He stopped before her, saying nothing, his hands resting on his hips. The silence between them was no longer fraught with tension or unspoken grief, but comfortable, easy, like the quiet between two people who have worked a long day side by side. "I finished it," she said, her voice soft. She held the coat out to him. He took it. It was heavier than he remembered, and clean. She had brushed out all the ash and mud, and it smelled of soap and sunshine in her. He ran a hand down the front. The fabric was whole. The lining, where he had torn it twice for her, was patched with a piece of dark, sturdy wool, the stitches so fine and even they were nearly invisible. He looked at the buttons. They were all there, sewn back on with a thick, waxed linen thread that was twice as strong as the original. They were no longer just fasteners. They were anchors, each one a small, deliberate act of making whole. There was no last button, no final escape. A short, genuine smile touched Coulter's lips, crinkling the corners of his pale eyes. He looked from the coat to her face, her features softened in the afternoon light. "When I need to," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I'll still undo them, but it'll be to cover you, not to run away." He had answered the challenge she had given him in the smoke and ruins of the fire. He was no longer running. He was staying. She looked at him, her gaze clear and direct, and in her eyes he saw not just gratitude, but an equal, matching strength. She reached into her apron pocket and took out the small, scarred maple music box. She held it not with the desperate, protective grip of before, but gently, on her open palm. She held it out to him. "This is yours now," she said. He looked at the box, then at her, a question in his eyes. "If you break it, you fix it," she said, her voice quiet but firm, repeating the words that had started it all. Then, she added the words that changed everything. "And if I break, you catch me." It was an offering of a trust so complete, so profound, it left him breathless. It was her whole heart, placed gently in his scarred hands. He didn't answer with words. He took the music box from her and carefully placed it in his own pocket. Then, he reached out and gently took her good hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He drew her to her feet. He stood before her, the sounds of the town, a hammer ringing in the blacksmith's shop, the distant laughter of children fading into a soft, distant hum. He raised his other hand and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He leaned down, slowly, and touched his forehead to hers. They stood like that for a long moment, simply breathing the same air, their worlds finally, completely aligned. The scent of rain-soaked earth rose around them. He could feel the fine, soft tremor of her breath. Then, he closed the small distance between them, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not born of fire or desperation. It was as quiet and steady as the new flowing water in the ditch. It was short, real, and held the taste of salt and sunlight and a promise that felt more like a prayer. It was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of the work. They drew apart slowly, the world coming back into focus. And just as it did, a pack of children, led by the blacksmith's red-ribboned daughter, Sarah, came tearing around the corner, chasing each other with wild, joyful abandon. They splashed through a puddle left by the storm, sending an arc of muddy water flying through the air, spattering the hem of Eliza's dress and Coulter's boots. The children shrieked with laughter and kept running, their small feet pounding a happy, chaotic rhythm on the damp ground. For a second, Coulter and Eliza just looked at each other, stunned. Then, a slow smile spread across Eliza's face, and she began to laugh. It was a sound Coulter had never heard before, a full, genuine laugh that seemed to rise up from the very soles of her feet. And he found himself laughing with her, a deep, rumbling sound of pure, unburdened joy. The town was alive. The future was noisy and messy and wonderful. Later that week, after he had arranged for his two young hands to take the herd the rest of the way to the railhead in Abilene, Coulter Hale went to see Judge Miller before he left town. He didn't ask for a reward or a commendation. He used the money from his trail boss contract to purchase a small, neglected parcel of land. It was the quarter-acre right next to Eliza March's shop. He spent the next month working. He did not build a grand house. He built a small, sturdy stable for his mare. He built a long, covered porch that connected the stable to the side of Eliza's shop, with two rocking chairs placed at one end. It was a porch built for waiting, for watching sunsets, for sharing a quiet cup of coffee as the morning light broke over the plains. It was a porch built for coming home. One afternoon, as he was finishing the last of the railings, Eliza came out of her shop. She was carrying a newly painted sign. She took down the old, faded board that read, "March's Seamstress Dry Goods." In its place, she hung the new one. The lettering was simple, elegant, and clear. It read, "March's Mending," and underneath, in smaller, graceful script, were two more words, "Hearts, too." That evening, they sat together in the rocking chairs on the new porch, watching as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. The air was cool and smelled of freshly cut pine and the promise of a good harvest. From inside the shop, where he had left it on the mantelpiece, the faint, tinny notes of a music box could be heard, playing a familiar tune. The melody of home no longer sounded lonely or sad. It was just a simple fact, a quiet song that ngan die into the peaceful twilight. The town of Sagebrush Crossing lived on, and Coulter Hale and Eliza March, two broken people made whole, continued to choose each other every single morning. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.